Ministers are coming under intense pressure to put the brakes on the government's flagship welfare reform program, following damning new evidence that it is leaving thousands of low-paid workers unable to pay the rent and at risk of homelessness. The Observer can reveal a catalogue of concerns from landlords, councils and charities about universal credit, which have been handed to a parliamentary inquiry investigating the program. With the accelerated rollout of the new system just weeks away, some warn that rent arrears among tenants receiving universal credit are running at 3, 4 or even 5 times the level of those on the old system. 3 councils whose tenants have already been moved on to universal credit said they had built up about £18 million in rent arrears. Croydon, Hounslow and Southwark said that more than 2,500 tenants claiming it were now at risk of eviction. Some food banks reported that marriages had broken down as a result of the extra pressures of waiting for payments, while some landlords are now choosing not to accept tenants on universal credit. Figures obtained by the Observer under the Freedom of Information Act also show that half of all council tenants across 105 local authorities who receive the housing element of universal credit, which replaces housing benefit, are at least a month behind on the rent, with 30% 2 months behind. By contrast, less than 10% of council tenants on housing benefit are a month behind on the rent, with under 5% running more than 2 months behind. More than 30 submissions to the Work and Pensions Select Committee's inquiry into universal credit highlight 2 main problems. The first is the 6-week wait before claimants receive the first payment, with widespread reports of some claimants waiting even longer. The new system also sees money for rent going to tenants, rather than straight to the landlords. While the Department for Work and Pensions (DWP) says the measure is designed to encourage claimants to manage the money, landlords are warning that it is simply leading to rising rent arrears. London Councils, the body that represents the capital's 32 boroughs and the City of London, said the new system places both claimants and local authorities in a position of financial insecurity. It said that in areas where universal credit had been fully implemented, there had been a dramatic decrease in rent collection, with many tenants immediately falling into rent arrears. The Peabody Group, a housing association that owns and manages more than 55,000 homes in London and the South East, said the rate of rent arrears among its tenants on universal credit was 3 times greater than those not on the new benefit. It said the average level of arrears for those on universal credit was £1,400 per household. Halton Housing Trust, which owns and manages 7,000 homes in Cheshire, said that while just 17% of its customers were receiving universal credit, they owed 47% of all its outstanding arrears. We are also seeing an increased risk of claimants who are unable to sustain the tenancy due to increased rent arrears, it said. Plymouth Community Homes, which has more than 14,000 social rented homes, said 69% of its tenants on universal credit were in arrears, compared to 29% of all tenants. Gloucester City Homes, which has more than 4,000 rented properties, said 85% of its universal credit claimants were in arrears, compared to 20% of all other tenants. Islington Council in London said 81% of its universal credit claimants were in arrears, compared to 29% across all of its tenants. Chesterfield Borough Council said 77% of its tenants in receipt of universal credit had rent arrears. The Trussell Trust, Britain's biggest food bank network, said that it had come across instances of people referred to food banks having to wait for far longer periods than 6 weeks, including up to 10 and 13 weeks for the first payment. It also reported 4 recent instances of people dealing with the breakdown of marriages due to financial pressure. The new Charter Group, which owns 20,000 homes across Greater Manchester and Nottinghamshire, said evictions are likely to increase, leading to higher level of homelessness. Centrepoint, which provides housing for homeless young people, said some had waited up to 10 weeks for the first payment. This places tenants at risk of homelessness, as they can legally be served a notice to seek possession when rent is unpaid for 8 weeks, it said. David Smith, Policy Director at the Residential Landlords Association, which represents more than 50,000 private sector landlords, said some members were now increasingly reluctant to house people on universal credit. Officials insist programs designed to help those who are struggling with payments. However, reports suggest help is not always offered to those who need it. Several sources have suggested that David Gorky, the Work and Pensions Secretary, may be open to slowing down the program should the department's latest data show up problems. Senior figures are now calling for a pause and overhaul of the system before it is rolled out even faster from next month. Bob Kerslake, former permanent secretary at the Department for Communities and Local Government and now chairman of the Peabody Trust, said everybody can see the potential benefits of this policy, but the implementation is critical and there is now enough evidence about the problems of arrears, particularly for some very vulnerable groups, that makes it essential that these issues are addressed before the rollout continues. Nick McPherson, a former permanent secretary at the Treasury, said, "I still worry about housing support being paid straight to the recipient rather than the landlord, and I question the prioritization of pensioner benefits over working-age benefits. Universal credit is insufficiently generous to provide genuine income support to the poor and workless." A DWP spokeswoman said universal credit is getting more people into work than the old system. It mirrors the way most people in work are paid, helping to ease the transition into employment. The majority of claimants are comfortable managing the budgets, and for people who need extra support, advance payments are available.